thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity to present this work. Something which we have been doing for the last 2 years at IISc Bangalore. And this has got to do with the convection within the Earth's core, which gives rise to the magnetic field of the planet, as you know. Now, to those of you who have not yet appreciated how the Earth's magnetic field is generated, the Earth's deep interior has a multi-layered structure. The outermost layer is the crust, and as you go deep down, you have a 2,900 kilometer thick, highly viscous mantle. And beneath the mantle, we have a highly electrically conducting liquid iron core. And still deep inside, right at the center of the planet, we have a inner core, which is solid iron. Now, when the planet formed, the inner iron core did not exist. So it formed by nucleation at a time which is believed to be slightly less than 1 billion years ago from now. And it's constantly growing. And as it grows, by crystallization, light elements get constantly released from the surface. And these elements rise and settle at the boundary between the core and the mantle. And as they rise, they stir the fluid. And that is considered to be an important source of buoyancy for the Earth's core. And on top of that, we also have thermal convection, which existed prior to the formation of the Earth's inner core. Right now, convection is thermochemical, and the chemical part is considered to be the dominant one. And this convection gives rise to a magnetic field through induction, and this magnetic field is predominantly an axial dipole. Yeah, that is, it's not an easy question to answer, but it is definitely, well, I don't want to venture into a number there, but it's considered to be significantly higher. And the ratio of the diffusivities of the solute to the heat is considered to be of order 10 cube, which means that the Rayleigh number that is defined based on composition will be substantially higher than the Rayleigh number defined based on temperature. So that is the underlying. Yes, most simulations use a parameter called co-density, which is supposed to mimic both temperature and composition as one variable, as a unified variable. But recently we have come across studies where they have split. So there will be 2 species equations which are time-stepped with different diffusivities, and that kind of modeling is still relatively in its infancy. That's not really taken on. So this is for beginners what a computer simulation of the Earth's dynamo looks like. So these columns, so these are actually shown on spherical surfaces. The blue ones are sinking fluid, radially sinking fluid, and the red ones are the fluid which come out. So these columns, which are often called Taylor columns, are considered to be essential for the north-south dipolar symmetry of the Earth's magnetic field, which is borne out by observations. Although the Earth's magnetic field is not a perfect dipole, it has got a significant dipolar component. Now, the nonlinear dynamo equations are also probably familiar to many of you here. We have, these are equations in a rotating reference frame, and on top of classical buoyancy, we also have the Lorentz force, which is arising from the interaction between the induced electric current and the magnetic field. This is the magnetic induction equation, and many models have temperature as the driving as the species. Although, as I said, if you replace T with a composition C, it would still be perfectly self-consistent. These are the dimensionless parameters which we normally use in the problem. E is the Ekman number, the ratio of the viscous to Coriolis forces. This is the classical Rayleigh number multiplied by the Ekman number. It's often known as the modified Rayleigh number. Prandtl number is familiar to most of you, and the magnetic Prandtl number is the ratio of the kinematic to the viscosity to magnetic diffusivity. Now, this study is mostly about a region of the Earth's core called the tangent cylinder, which has been the subject of considerable interest. This cylinder is actually an imaginary cylinder which is tangent to the Earth's inner core, and it's parallel to the rotation axis. And observations of the secular variation of the Earth's magnetic field suggest that there are anticyclonic vortices in the polar regions. And this has been used to actually probe the deep interior of the planet. Now, it is thought that the concentration of light elements in the poles is slightly higher than the concentration of light elements in the equatorial region, so because they constantly rise and build up there. So the polar regions are likely to be slightly warmer than the equatorial regions. Because of this, we have a latitudinal temperature gradient. And because of Earth's rotation, this thermal wind equation gives rise to an anticyclonic polar vortex in both the northern and southern hemispheres. Okay. However, you have to keep in mind that this is a non-magnetic argument. And the moment we look at the magnetic field effect on this process through dynamo models, what we find is not a perfectly axisymmetric vortex, but a highly non-axisymmetric vortex, and this is produced as a result of an isolated plume, which I am showing in this slide. So here we have taken a cut section here. Okay, suppose you take a cut section, horizontal cut section, and look from above, and this is what you see. So I've looked at two parameter regimes. One is a relatively high Ekman number, which is relatively weak rotation. This is relatively rapid rotation for the same viscosity. And these are the plumes which are formed in the dynamo model. And these are the structures of convection without the magnetic field, that is in pure convection. So as you can see, there is a substantial difference between the structure of convection with and without magnetic fields. So the magnetic field significantly changes the structure of convection. This is not an entirely new result. This was observed by us, observed by me, in fact, about 10 years ago when I was a postdoc. But since then, after publishing, we had left it there. But recently, we had the opportunity to revisit this problem again. And we found that the places where these localized plumes appear are the places where the magnetic field concentrations also take place. Now, this is the axial magnetic field, Bz, inside the tangent cylinder. This is the axial velocity, Uz. So there is a strong Bz-Uz correlation inside the tangent cylinder. And if you unwrap the tangent cylinder and construct these rectangular plots, you can see that as I increase the Rayleigh number in steps, what happens is a threshold Rayleigh number is reached when this isolated plume occurs. So it might, those who are not familiar with dynamo models may find this a bit counterintuitive, because increasing the Rayleigh number is not supposed to suppress convection. It is supposed to promote convection. But in this particular case, by increasing the Rayleigh number, we are actually trying to suppress convection, and only one isolated plume survives. And this phenomenon is completely absent in non-magnetic convection. So this, the bottom row is about non-magnetic simulation. Now, what is going on here, which is quite interesting, as the Rayleigh number increases, the intensity of the magnetic field that is generated within the tangent cylinder also increases. And when that happens, it controls the convection in a certain curious way. To understand this further, what we did is we increased the Rayleigh number to a slightly higher value. And what we found was that whenever there is a magnetic field patch, the velocity field always tries to catch up with it. So it chases, the velocity chases the magnetic field. And there is a time lag before which the velocity field can catch up. So if this is visible to you, this time is 2.014, and at time 2.092, which is approximately slightly less than a 0.1 diffusion, magnetic diffusion time, the velocity field has reached the place where the magnetic field was. On the other hand, if we take the same time as 2.014, there is no correlation. The velocity field was elsewhere. The velocity field has taken some time to reach the location of the magnetic field. And this keeps going on in cycles. So this led to the conclusion that the velocity field is behaving as if it was a slave of the magnetic field. So there was a magnetic field which is forming, and once it is formed, it is controlling the velocity field in some way. So that is the summary which we reached after these simulations. So the first point is that there is a strong localization of convection within the tangent cylinder. I'll come to that point, why this is important geophysically. Okay. So this onset of an isolated plume is noted for a threshold field strength. So we can actually measure that field strength in the dynamo model at which it happens. And what is likely to happen is that the magnetic field can overcome through the Lorentz force the Taylor-Proudman constraint, and it can locally reduce the Rayleigh number for convection. And when that happens, the plume immediately goes and sits there. Okay? And the rest of the fluid layer, there is no convection because the Rayleigh number is above. The Rayleigh number is below the threshold for this to happen. Okay? Axial, yes. No, Z. That is the predominant direction of the field in the tangent cylinder is axial. Another interesting point is that the critical Rayleigh number for this isolated plume formation increases with decreasing E. So if you rotate it faster, this plume happens at higher Rayleigh number. Okay? And this to us suggests a kind of viscous mode of onset, okay, like the classical pure rotation. To study this further, what we did is we set up a model in Cartesian geometry where we had an inhomogeneous magnetic field. So we had an axial magnetic field which was laterally varying. Okay, so the magnetic field is in the z direction, it is a function of x. And we chose a function such that this imposed field does not generate any mean flow through the through the momentum equation. This is ensured by calculating curl of J naught across B naught. That is 0, then we don't have to worry about any mean flows that is coming out of this magnetic field. And we set up the problem in a linearized MHD framework. The thing that is notable here is that the Lorentz force will have two components because of its spatial variation. There will be a curl of mean multiplied by fluctuation plus curl of fluctuation multiplied crossed with mean. Okay, so that is the only difference from the apart from the fact that the rest of the equations are all linear. And these are our eigenfunctions. So we do not consider time dependence because partly because it is computationally simpler, and partly because what we are interested in is the steady state, a quasi-steady state of the problem, structure of the convection, rather than a transient state. Now this is what you expect in the classical Rayleigh-Benard with a magnetic field. This comes from Chandrasekhar in 1961. And here we have two modes. One is the viscous, which is thin, tall, thin columns, and these are magnetic rolls. And this transition occurs as an Alsacer number, which is essentially a square of the dimensionless magnetic field. It occurs at order Ekman to the 1/3. Now, this is a very famous result, and it dates back to the 70s. And this is one of the examples. And there is a wave number which decreases sharply at this transition. So there is a viscous magnetic mode transition. And this is what you find here. So if you look at uniform field, if you look at the red and the green curves, these are the Chandrasekhar curves essentially, which says that here the flow is viscously controlled, and once at Ekman to the 1/3 Alsacer, it suddenly starts dropping. So the critical Rayleigh number for onset will decrease sharply. Okay. So we repeated the same exercise with an inhomogeneous field and for a range of Ekman numbers, and we get similar regime diagrams where we have a viscous mode and followed by a magnetic mode. But that is not the main point of the study. The main point of the study is to show that the magnetic field can drastically change the structure of convection. And contrary to what we know from classical theory, the Rayleigh number doesn't change. The Rayleigh number is almost the same as that for non-magnetic convection. Now, how does that happen? It happens because if you look at this picture, these two pictures, so this can be thought of a box. This is the front view of the box, and this is the top view of the box. And the wave number here will tell you whether it is viscously controlled or magnetically controlled. So these are the two Ekman numbers. The one which is rapidly rotating is showing several tiny convection cells, because as you know from classical linear onset theory, the wave number has to go as Ekman to the minus 1/3. So the number of rolls will go up. Okay. And so this obeys approximately obeys the classical theory. On the other hand, the magnetic field has a bigger role to play. The magnetic field is trying to localize convection where it is strong. And in the process, it suppresses convection where it is weak. So the magnetic field has an overall effect on the flow, and at the same time, the length scale of the convection is not affected. Now that is a unique situation, which can be captured only if we have a configuration like this. What happens if I increase the field strength? If I increase the field strength, changing Ekman number has absolutely no change on the convection pattern. You still have localization due to the magnetic field, but just look at the Rayleigh numbers. They are almost independent of Ekman number. Okay? They are approximately 190. So in the previous case, the Rayleigh number was a very strong function of the Ekman number. So this difference is essentially the difference between the viscous mode and the magnetic mode. The viscous mode, the Rayleigh number is a strong function of the Ekman number, whereas in the magnetic mode, the Rayleigh number is not a function of the Ekman number. Okay. So the essential message that came out of this study is that convection is strongly localized by the field, but the smallest length scale is still viscously controlled. Now, this picture gives you the force balance of the balance of the various forces in the momentum equation, because our method doesn't solve for the pressure gradient. So what we did is we looked at the Coriolis, the Lorentz, and the viscous terms in the equation of motion. And for a viscous mode calculation at a reasonably low Ekman number. And what we find is that by plotting this Lorentz and viscous forces on the same color scale, we found that the Lorentz forces is at least 5 times stronger than the viscous forces. So the Lorentz force is thus able to overcome the Taylor-Proudman constraint and set up convection, okay, which is and at the same time, the convection has a length scale that is viscously controlled. Now, Why is this so important, you might wonder. Before coming to that, I'll sum up what we have found. The magnetic field appears to promote convection locally in a rotating plane layer. Okay? And we need lateral variation to see this, because if the magnetic field were uniform, you would not be seeing this, because earlier studies considered only convection either in the small scale viscous mode or in the large scale magnetic mode. So they did not have any hybrid behavior. Okay? And whereas in this particular case, we are actually having magnetically localized convection of the viscous length scale. And the critical Rayleigh number at which these isolated plumes form, they agree closely with the onset value for the viscous branch of the magnetoconvection regime diagram. So another important fallout of this study is that within the spherical shell itself, there can be regions which are strongly nonlinear, there can be regions which are approximately linear. Because the formation of an isolated plume within the tangent cylinder has been studied by a linear model. There is good agreement with the Dynamo model and the linear model. But on the other hand, we know that nonlinear dynamo action exists outside the tangent cylinder. So this is good news as far as the dynamo community is concerned, because the tangent cylinder, at least close to the onset, can be treated linearly, even though outside it is highly nonlinear. Now, this is particularly important for the Earth's core, because we believe that small scale velocity fields interact with small scale magnetic fields to give rise to a large scale mean magnetic field. This idea goes back to the 1960s. For actually this to work, we actually need some small scales in the core. Okay? Now, previous studies said that if Elsasser is as small as of order Ekman to the 1/3, all that we get is giant magnetic rolls. So now we have found a way out of this difficulty. So we can actually have small scale convection, which can give rise to a large scale mean magnetic field. Now, there are other observational constraints also which seem to agree with this. Look at the polar region. From observations, the magnetic flux is very weak there. And the flux lobes are concentrated just outside the tangent cylinder. So it's very likely that convection within the tangent cylinder is dominated by one or two isolated plumes, which are actually generated by this mechanism. And the polar vortices within the Earth's core can therefore be non-axis symmetric, as opposed to the classical non-magnetic theory, which predicts that it will be axis symmetric. And small-scale convection can exist, as I just mentioned. Now, this study is important because it's unfortunately it's not possible to to see these scales, to visualize these scales through secular variation observations, because of the crustal magnetic field of the Earth prevents studying scales which are shorter than a few thousand kilometers. Whereas scales of magnetic Reynolds number of order 1 will only be a few kilometers across. So that is why models like these are important in order to understand the dynamics of the core, where observations still cannot reach.
The force balance that you showed in the previous slide, is that the Coriolis force? Is it the unbalanced Coriolis force?
It is the net. It is the X component of the Coriolis force.
So without the pressure gradient?
Without the pressure gradient, yes.
So you're basically looking at the vorticity equation and the terms.
It is actually in the momentum only.
Okay, so it means the actual component of
Yeah,
the force.
so there will be a pressure gradient, which of course we have not calculated.
Yeah.
But the idea is that of that slide was to show that the Lorentz force is significant compared to the viscous force, whereas one would initially expect the viscous force to be dominant because it's a viscous mode. But that's not the case. The Lorentz force is actually overseeing the onset of convection there.
So maybe
the scale of onset is viscous.
perhaps if we do subtract the pressure gradient part, perhaps the Coriolis and Lorentz will be comparable as well. That's my guess. Because if you look at
in that particular regime, it's very likely the pressure gradient is comparable to the Coriolis. On the other hand, if you take the curl of the, I have not put that slide here. If you take the balance in the vorticity equation,
yes,
we can actually see the viscous and Coriolis terms balancing in this regime, and the magnetic and Coriolis balancing in the magnetic branch. So
right.
the balance of terms in the vorticity equation actually tells us what is the mode of onset.
Right.
The purpose of this slide was not to underestimate the effect of the pressure gradient, but to show that the Lorentz force does have a significant effect in actually setting up convection, even though the scale of the convection is small.
So can you argue out from the equations itself that why there should be a lag between the velocity field and the magnetic?
Yeah, so we did that experiment, numerical experiment, because at lower Rayleigh numbers, it was not possible to determine what was causing what. It looked like a chicken and egg problem. Is the flow localizing the field, or is it the field localizing the flow? Okay, so there we did not know what was going on. So what we did is we somehow thought that it was the field that was controlling the flow. But how do we show that? So to show that, well, it was a thought experiment which worked out. We increased the Rayleigh number slightly. And when we increased the Rayleigh number slightly, we saw that the magnetic field, as soon as it formed, after a finite time lag, the velocity field reaches there. So what presumably happens there is that the magnetic field tries to, through the Lorentz force, locally tries to reduce the critical Rayleigh number for onset. Locally, not globally, locally. Once that happens, convection immediately senses that. Okay, but it takes a very short time for convection to catch up. It's not instantaneous, because the Rayleigh number is not that small. Okay. If the Rayleigh number is increased further, what happens is that this correlation completely breaks down. We don't see anything. Okay. So this happens only for intermediate Rayleigh numbers. Very high Rayleigh numbers, you cannot see this correlation at all. So at very small Rayleigh numbers, we have perfect correlation, in which case it's not easy to figure out what is controlling what. The intermediate Rayleigh numbers, it becomes slightly clearer. But in the higher Rayleigh number limit, it's not clear again. That's the thing. What happens is, as you increase the Rayleigh number, the magnetic field concentration within the tangent cylinder increases. Okay. Once the magnetic field concentration exceeds a certain threshold, only then this mechanism kicks in. Right? So, it takes some finite time for the magnetic field to actually grow, although that is something which we cannot perform. So that calculation we cannot perform through the numerical model. But definitely there appears to be a formation phase and a control phase which follows the formation phase. Okay? So the formation phase is not something which I have discussed here. The control phase is what we can see, because it is there for a much longer time. It is the quasi-steady phenomenon. Formation phase is a transient phenomenon. It's a very short period. So, so we don't have the technology yet to actually capture that.
Any other question?